137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 3 decks stacked like the floors of a building. These are not poetic exaggerations. The Bible records these dimensions in Genesis 6. Imagine standing at one end of that hull and looking down a line of wood that stretches longer than many modern ships. And then ask the question nobody has made us ask clearly enough. How do you build a continuous backbone for a vessel when no tree grows that long? That is the hidden detail in Noah's Ark that history rarely points to. The Ark's keel could not have been a single unbroken trunk. It had to be made, deliberately and with great care, by joining multiple enormous timbers into one continuous keel. That technical necessity becomes the narrative hinge of the whole story, both for the ship's structural integrity and for the deeper meaning woven through the text. Walk with me to the banks where the ark is being raised. Smell the resin and sawdust in the air. Hear the rhythm of axe blows and the low groan of ropes. Neighbors pass by and shake their heads. Children whisper and elders jeer. Noah's family moves with purpose. Shem, Ham, Japheth and their wives, hands raw from rope and adze. The dimensions came as an instruction, not a suggestion. The command was precise. The obedience had to be equally exact. But obeying the numbers raised practical problems, real mechanical problems that demanded practical solutions, the kind of solutions that mix patient craft with reliance on the Almighty's word. First, the sight. The Bible hints at a world where the fountains of the great deep and the mist rising from the earth change the behavior of ground and water. The pre-flood landscape was consistently damp. The soil held moisture in ways they had to reckon with. Building a vessel of that scale meant choosing a firm, level platform near stands of cypress. It is plausible that Noah selected a rise of ground or drove simple piling to form a dry working pad. Drainage trenches would be dug, small diversion channels cut to carry off surface water, and flat ramps laid to slide cut timbers out toward the ark's footprint. These were humble engineering decisions, digging, bundling, moving, but they mattered. Without a stable base, the whole enterprise would shift during assembly. Cypress was the likely choice for many reasons: durable, straight-grained, and naturally resistant to rot. The drama of felling and transporting these trees is easy to imagine. Men with hatchets and adzes would carve wedges, set lines of rope, and use rollers. Round poles laid beneath a log's length to pull the trunks. Levers and fulcrums multiplied human strength. The sound of wood cracking and the wet, pungent aroma of resin filled the air. Where a single monotrunk of the ark's keel would have been impossible, multiple long beams, each still enormous by any measure, could be felled and prepared. And here lies the hidden detail, the continuous keel. In a modern mind, the word keel suggests a single, unbroken backbone. But reality in Noah's day meant joining heavy timbers to create that backbone. The Bible gives the overall form and leaves the method unsaid. It is plausible, then, that the Arkrites used carefully crafted joinery to form a continuous central beam. They did not haphazardly strap pieces together. They would have used time-tested woodworking techniques adapted for scale. Consider how craftsmen join timbers when length exceeds what the forest offers. A likely solution is a long, interlocking scarf joint. 2 timbers cut, so their ends overlap along an angled or stepped surface, increasing the contact area so the joint behaves like a single, continuous piece when under load. Such joints are held together with wooden pegs or cavillas driven through holes bored across the overlapping section. These pegs, often of denser hardwood, lock the faces together. Mortise and tenon details could be added where beams intersect with transoms, and internal cleats would serve to clamp joint surfaces during curing and sealing. They may also have used locking keys, small wedges driven into slots, to tighten a joint once the beams were fitted. All this could be done with hand tools, adzes for shaping, chisels for compact joinery, and long ropes acting as clamps while workers hammered pegs into place. To make such joints at a length of 137 meters meant extraordinary planning and constant alignment checks. Lines stretched taut from one end of the keel to the other. Simple plumb weights and sighting poles allowed builders to verify straightness. A nightly ritual of checking with a line and a weight, primitive, yes, but effective, would prevent cumulative drift. The act of joining pieces was thus not merely an assembly task. It required a regimented process, measured against a divine specification. This technical choice carried theological resonance. Each joint, where two timbers met and were held by pegs and keys, became an expression of continuity by union. The keel, assembled from many pieces, became a single backbone for the ark, as a family becomes a single vessel under God's command. Those connections, visible only to the builders, were hidden from the mockers, but essential for survival. The ark's structure, in this reading, becomes a metaphor. God's promise, sustained through the joining of many small acts of faith and obedience. With the keel laid in joined segments, the next stage was to raise the ribs, the framed costae that give a hull its shape. Workers would lash temporary forms to the keel, using longitudinal guides to ensure symmetry on both port and starboard. To lift the ribs, men likely employed inclined planes, ramps running from ground level up to the keel, so that huge bent timbers could be hauled and positioned with ropes. At each station, temporary braces held the rib in place, while mortise sockets were prepared and tenons driven or pegged. Frequent checks for balance were essential. If too many ribs were set on one side before the other, the hull would tip. Lines, sighting poles, and counterweights helped maintain equilibrium. It is plausible that a single team marched along the length, setting ribs in a measured sequence to distribute stress and maintain centerline alignment. Inside, the concept of kinning in, internal divisions, served multiple purposes: strength, order, and preservation. By subdividing the interior into compartments across 3 decks, the builders created transverse bulkheads that reinforced the hull's lateral strength and controlled torsion. Rows of stalls and pens, separated by partitions, allowed for orderly animal housing and efficient storage. Compartments helped prevent cargo from shifting during the turbulence of rolling seas. They also made life manageable. A place for feed, another for bedding and dung, separate floor levels for different sizes of animals, and even a designated area for Noah and his family. Ventilation channels and vents kept air moving. A continuous low slot beneath the deck edges, combined with the natural upward movement of warm, moist air, could provide passive ventilation. It is plausible that the kinning in included narrow service passages, allowing caretakers to move along the hull to tend animals without crossing into each stall. Food storage was another logistical mountain. Grain and dry stores likely went into sealed bins within the lower compartments, while fresh fodder was stacked on upper decks for ease of daily distribution. Water was to be managed carefully. Though surrounded by water, the ark's occupants needed fresh water stores. Casks, jars, and pits kept potable supplies. Waste management demanded attention. Channels along deck edges could collect runoff, and shallow sumps might keep liquids from stagnating. Daily labor, feeding, cleaning, mending seals, became a rhythm. The ark was not simply a floating zoo. It was a working house sustained by steady human care. Sealing the hull was decisive. The Bible records that Noah used pitch, and he covered it inside and out with pitch, a formulation found in the narrative. Bitumen, a natural tar, was available in the ancient Near East and serves as a practical waterproofing agent. The process of applying bitumen to the outside and inside required heat to soften the material and skilled hands to work it into seams. A likely technique, workers heated small batches and slathered them over seams and joint faces, pressing fibers or caulking material, plans, moss or felt, into gaps before smoothing the pitch over them. Inside, pitch provided an additional layer against leakage and helped keep the living spaces dry. As the material cooled, it set into a durable coating, but proper curing required time and controlled application. Thus the builders would have allowed intervals between major assembly steps to ensure the seams set and the joined keel sections behaved as an integrated backbone under load. The ark's lateral integrity depended in part on how the door was framed. The text says plainly, "The Lord shut the door," Genesis 7:16. That phrase carries both a technical and theological weight. Technically, a door of the ark would be a vulnerable point. An opening in a hull invites stress concentration around its frame. To mitigate this, the builders likely framed the door within a reinforced section of the hull, with extra transoms and longitudinal beams forming a strong lintel and threshold. A vertical pivot or post might serve as a hinge, a sturdy beam set into a socket at top and bottom, similar to door pivots known in ancient carpentry, allowing the door to swing with minimal gap. Wooden wedges and a tight-fitting jamb, sealed with pitch, could make the door weather-tight under calm conditions. Yet when storms rose and pressures increased, the spiritual language records that the final act of closure was God's sovereign sealing. The builders could prepare the mechanism. Divine agency completed it. The phrase, "The Lord shut the door," therefore reads as both legal and literal, the seal of God's protection and the finalization of the covenantal shelter. All the while, life aboard the ark would be a discipline of schedules and rotating tasks. Feeding hundreds of animals demands rationing and rotation. The family would have organized a roster, those who processed fodder, those who tended the smaller mammals and birds, those who handled the larger beasts. Noise and smell would not be absent, but structure kept chaos at bay. The creak of timber and occasional settling strains were constant reminders that the vessel was living under the strain of the waters. The crew, Noah and his household, learned to read the ark's sounds like a doctor reads a patient's breathing. Then came the moment described plainly. Animals entered, paired by divine arrangement, the family boarded, and the Lord shut the door. The rain followed as the fountains of the deep burst and the skies poured. The ark, with its assembled joined keel and reinforced ribs, began to float. The narrative gives measured time markers, 40 days and nights of rain, months when the waters prevailed, the eventual abatement as God remembered Noah, and the waters receded. During these months, the seams and joints were tested under real stress, stretching, swelling, and contracting as wood took on moisture and as the ship's timbers bore wave-induced bending moments. The success of those joints, the integrity of the glued and pegged scarfed keel, and the strength of the bulkheaded divisions were proven not by engineering calculation, but by their performance under God's sovereign care. One quiet scene is almost cinematic. After months adrift, Noah opens a window and releases a dove. The bird returns with an olive leaf, an emblem of life returning to the ground. Later, as the ark rests upon the mountains of Ararat and the family steps out onto a cleansed earth, Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifice. The covenant follows. God sets a sign in the sky. The physical journey ends and a spiritual settlement begins. The hidden detail we have held to through this telling, the keel made of many joined timbers, comes into its fullest meaning. The ark was a vessel of continuity. Its backbone was formed by prudent, coordinated work and finally held together by God's promise. Why dwell on joinery as a theological point? Because the method of construction speaks to the nature of obedience and the economy of preservation. The ark's keel was not an accident of design, it was an engineered solution to a practical impossibility. In that engineered solution, we find lessons for spiritual life. The truth that great tasks are rarely finished by a single act, but by a succession of precise, united actions. That continuity is created by repeated commitments. that every peg and every scarf joint, each small act of fidelity, joins us into a larger structure that can weather storms. The keel's many pieces become a single backbone, just as a people becomes one through shared obedience to a single command. It is important to be clear about what we are doing here. When we sketch these construction methods, we are offering plausible reconstruction based on known ancient woodworking techniques, not asserting archaeological proof. The text gives the dimensions and the essential events. The details of how the keel was assembled are reasonable inferences, practical reasoning grounded in what ancient craftsmen knew and could do. We avoid claiming this was the only way it could have been done. Other solutions might have been possible, but the scarfed and pegged, joined keel is one realistic approach that helps us imagine how an obedient people could turn an extraordinary command into a living reality. Beyond technique, consider the social rhythm required. A project of this scale demanded coordination across generations and among many hands. The mockers shouted because they saw the strange shape of a building where a boat should be. They did not see the careful alignments, the repeated tests, the patient pegging of joints. They did not know the early morning prayers that opened each day's labor. This combination of practical labor and spiritual steadiness forms another lesson. Obedience invites resistance, and resistance is often answered best by settled, disciplined work. We can also learn from the Ark's attention to redundancy. The use of multiple decks, subdivided compartments, and a framed door were redundancies built into the design, safety by division. In times of crisis, redundancy looks like forethought, storing extra food, building spare bins, making multiple ways to remove water from a deck. These are practical choices, and they are moral choices, acts of stewardship and care for life. Theological reflection on these practices yields no simplistic moral. It does not say that every meticulous plan guarantees a safe outcome. It does, however, show how prepared obedience creates conditions where God's sustaining power can operate. The narrative's climax is not merely that the ark floated, it is that life was preserved, that a human family and a sample of animal life were kept intact under dire circumstances. The Lord's closing of the door signals a divine endorsement of the shelter and a sovereign initiation of the flood's judgment. When the waters abated and the family stepped out, the first act, building an altar, was not technical. It was sacrificial gratitude, an offering to the God who had given both the command and the preservation. When God set the rainbow, it was not an engineering seal, but a covenantal promise. The world would not be given again to such a cataclysm by water in that way. So return to the hidden detail, the joined keel. It is the technical heart of the narrative's credibility. Without some form of large-scale joinery, a single continuous backbone would be impossible in that environment. The solution, careful, deliberate joints held by pegs, keys, and seals, becomes a story element and a symbol. It tells us that God's remarkable commands often require human discipline and craft to become manifest. That interplay between divine instruction and human workmanship frames much of the Bible's larger story. God calls, humanity builds, God sustains. As we leave the scene at Ararat, smelling the smoke from Noah's altar and watching the sky take on a new calm, there is one last reflection to carry forward. The ark's backbone was not merely structural wood, it was the visible result of patient, obedient union. It never pretended to be a miracle of human ingenuity alone. The joined trestles and peg-driven scarf joints stand as testimony to what small acts of faithfulness can accomplish when aligned to a higher command. In the same way, the communities we build, families, churches, societies, are often kept together by many small, careful acts that join us into a resilient whole. The hidden detail of the ark's keel asks us to notice that salvation frequently passes through the ordinary kindnesses and the repeated, disciplined labors of those who obey. If you're curious about what happened next, how the world reshaped after the flood, and how the covenant took root. Watch the follow-up video linked now. The Ark's story concludes with a promise and a charge. The craft of building and the act of worship both point to the same truth. God preserves by means that require human fidelity. The keel made of joined timbers is a single image that holds many lessons. It reminds us that continuity comes from union, that strength is often the product of careful, repeated small acts, and that obedience, even under ridicule, shapes the history that follows. When the people stepped onto the renewed earth and looked up to the signs set in the heavens, they carried with them the memory of an ark whose backbone was both wood and faith, joined, pegged, sealed, and finally upheld by the Lord who shut the door. If you want to dive deeper into the aftermath, the covenant's unfolding, the family's new beginning, and what it meant for the generations that followed, subscribe and watch the next episode.